What truly happens when the final breath leaves the body? Is death a sudden darkness, a doorway, or a carefully ordered journey that every human must walk alone? For thousands of years, civilizations have asked this question in whispers, prayers, and fear. Yet among all the ancient texts humanity has left behind, there is one book that dares to speak directly to the moment we are most afraid to imagine. A book that does not treat death as an ending, but as a transition. A book meant not for the living alone, but for the dead themselves. This is the mystery of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Before we go any further, pause for a moment. Not to fear death, but to understand it. Because the way a culture explains death reveals how it understands life. And perhaps, by exploring this ancient Tibetan text, we may come closer to understanding not only what happens when we die, but how we should live while we are still here. Welcome to a journey beyond time, beyond fear, and beyond the body. If this video brings you value, insight, or a new way of seeing the world, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support gives me the motivation to continue creating meaningful content that serves the community and preserves humanity's most profound wisdom. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is not its original name. In Tibetan, it is known as bardo, which can be translated as liberation through hearing in the intermediate state. This title alone changes everything. It suggests that death is not an instant event, but a process, a passage, a state between states. According to Tibetan Buddhism, when a person dies, consciousness does not vanish. Instead, it enters the bardo, an intermediate realm where the nature of the mind becomes vividly clear. Unlike many religious texts that focus on judgment, reward, or punishment, this book focuses on awareness. It assumes that the mind, freed from the physical body, encounters experiences shaped by its own habits, fears, attachments, and understanding. Heaven and hell are not places imposed by an external power, but reflections created by consciousness itself. The text was traditionally read aloud to the dying person, or to the body after death. This detail is crucial. It reveals a belief that consciousness can still hear, recognize, and awaken even after the heart has stopped beating. The words are not prayers for mercy. They are instructions, reminders, and guidance. They repeatedly urge the consciousness not to cling, not to panic, and not to mistake illusions for ultimate reality. At the heart of the Tibetan Book of the Dead lies a radical idea. Liberation is possible not only in life, but also in death. If the mind can recognize the true nature of reality during the bardo, it can be freed from the cycle of rebirth altogether. Death becomes not a tragedy, but a final opportunity. This perspective reshapes fear itself. Fear arises from the unknown, but this text attempts to map the unknown with extraordinary detail. It describes stages of experience, visions of light, encounters with peaceful and wrathful forms, and moments where clarity is possible if one has been prepared. These descriptions are not meant to terrify. They are meant to train the mind long before death arrives. The deeper message is subtle but powerful. How you die depends on how you live. The habits of the mind do not disappear at death. They intensify. A mind trained in awareness recognizes truth. A mind ruled by attachment becomes lost in its own projections. In this sense, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is not really a book about dying, it is a manual for living consciously. In the next part, we will explore the concept of the bardo itself in greater depth, and why Tibetan Buddhism believes there are multiple bardos, not only after death, but throughout life. To understand the Tibetan Book of the Dead, one must first understand the word that lies at its core, bardo. In the Western imagination, the bardo is often reduced to a single realm that appears after death, a strange waiting room between lives. But in Tibetan Buddhism, the bardo is far more profound. It is not merely a place, it is a condition of existence, a gap, a moment of transition where reality is fluid and the mind is exposed without protection. The Tibetan tradition teaches that human life itself unfolds through bardos. Birth is a bardo. Dreaming is a bardo. Meditation is a bardo. Death is a bardo. Rebirth is a bardo. Every moment where one state dissolves and another has not yet fully formed is a bardo. In this sense, we are constantly dying and being reborn, moment by moment, breath by breath. The after-death bardo is simply the most intense and decisive of them all. This insight carries a quiet but unsettling implication. If we cannot remain aware during the small transitions of everyday life, how will we remain aware during the greatest transition of all? According to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the bardo after death unfolds in stages. The body ceases, but consciousness continues. Freed from physical limitation, the mind becomes extraordinarily vivid. Thoughts instantly shape experience. Fear manifests as terrifying visions. Peace manifests as radiant clarity. There is no delay between intention and perception. The bardo is not slow. It is overwhelming. This is why preparation matters. The text repeatedly emphasizes recognition. If the consciousness recognizes what is happening, recognizes that the visions arise from the mind itself, liberation is possible. If it does not, it becomes swept away by habit, attraction, and fear, leading inevitably toward rebirth. The origin of this teaching is traditionally attributed to Padmasambhava, the Indian master who brought Tantric Buddhism to Tibet in the 8th century. According to legend, he concealed the teachings as hidden treasures to be discovered when humanity was ready. Whether taken literally or symbolically, this story reinforces a central theme of the text. Wisdom appears when conditions are ripe, and awakening depends on recognition, not belief. What makes the bardo so significant is its instability. Nothing in it is fixed. No vision lasts. No identity is solid. This instability creates danger, but it also creates opportunity. In ordinary life, habits are reinforced by repetition. In the bardo, habits unravel. The mind is raw, exposed, and impressionable. A single moment of clarity can outweigh an entire lifetime of confusion. This is why the Tibetan Book of the Dead speaks with urgency. Its tone is direct, almost intimate, addressing the consciousness as if it were still listening. Do not be afraid. Do not cling. Do not follow the light of desire. Recognize the clear light of reality. These words are not poetry. They are lifelines. There is something deeply human in this approach to death. It does not deny fear, but it does not surrender to it either. It acknowledges that the mind, when stripped of the body, will face itself without distraction. No social role, no possessions, no mask, only awareness meeting its own nature. In this way, the bardo is not a punishment or a test imposed from outside. It is a mirror, and mirrors do not judge. They only reveal. In the next part, we will enter the most mysterious and important moment described in the text: the experience of the clear light, the first and greatest opportunity for liberation after death. According to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the most decisive moment after death arrives almost immediately. It is quiet, it is subtle, and because of that, it is missed by nearly everyone. This moment is known as the clear light, the fundamental nature of mind revealed without obstruction. When the body dissolves and sensory perception collapses, consciousness briefly encounters reality as it truly is, unfiltered, undivided, and free from form. The text describes this moment not as a vision, but as recognition. There is no image to cling to, no sound to follow, no shape to fear. There is only awareness itself, luminous and boundless. For a consciousness trained in meditation or insight, this recognition can result in immediate liberation. Nothing further is required. No journey, no rebirth, no suffering. The cycle ends not through effort, but through seeing. Yet for most beings, this moment passes unnoticed. The tragedy is not that the clear light is inaccessible, but that it is unfamiliar. Throughout life, the mind is trained to grasp at objects, identities, and narratives. We learn to define ourselves through memory, emotion, and desire. When all of that falls away at death, the mind panics. It searches for something solid, something recognizable. In doing so, it turns away from the clear light and plunges into the next stage of the bardo. This insight is one of the most radical ideas in human spirituality. Liberation is not achieved by becoming something new, but by recognizing what has always been present. The clear light is not created at death. It is revealed. It is the same awareness experienced in deep meditation, in moments of profound stillness, and sometimes even in the space between thoughts. Death simply removes the distractions that normally conceal it. The Tibetan Book of the Dead speaks directly to the dying consciousness at this moment, urging it to remain calm and recognize what is appearing. These instructions are repeated again and again, not because the truth changes, but because the mind is so easily drawn away from it. Fear arises. Habit takes over. The opportunity slips past like a dream forgotten upon waking. What follows this missed recognition is not punishment, but consequence. Consciousness begins to move outward again, generating experiences shaped by karmic patterns. The luminous openness of the clear light gives way to form, color, sound, and identity. The journey continues, not because liberation was denied, but because it was not recognized. This is why the text places such importance on preparation during life. Meditation is not presented as a moral duty or spiritual achievement, but as training for recognition. Familiarity with the nature of mind becomes the most valuable possession at death. Not belief, not faith, familiarity. There is something profoundly compassionate in this teaching. It does not divide humanity into the saved and the damned. It acknowledges confusion as natural, not sinful. It presents liberation as always available, even in the final moment, even after a life of mistakes. The door is never locked. It is only unseen. In the next part, we will explore what happens when the clear light is missed, and consciousness enters the visionary realm of the bardo, where peaceful and wrathful forms arise as reflections of the mind itself. When the clear light is not recognized, consciousness does not stop. It moves. It begins to generate experience again, but now without the anchor of a physical body. This is where the Tibetan Book of the Dead becomes most vivid, and to many readers, most unsettling. The text describes a sequence of visions that arise with overwhelming intensity, populated by peaceful and wrathful forms that seem at first glance to resemble gods, demons, or divine judges. But the text is careful, almost relentless, in repeating one crucial message. These forms are not external beings. They are manifestations of the mind itself. In the early phase of this visionary bardo, consciousness encounters radiant, peaceful forms associated with wisdom, clarity, and compassion. They appear luminous, harmonious, and awe-inspiring. Their presence can evoke deep attraction, reverence, or longing. Yet even here, the danger remains. If the mind clings to these visions as something other than itself, it misses the opportunity for liberation. The instruction is always the same. Do not follow. Do not fear. Do not desire. Recognize. As the process continues, the visions grow more intense. Wrathful forms arise, fierce in appearance, surrounded by fire, sound, and movement. They embody anger, terror, and power. To an unprepared mind, these experiences can feel like judgment or punishment. But the text insists that fear itself is the trap. The wrathful forms are not hostile forces attacking the consciousness. They are the raw energy of the mind, appearing without disguise. This teaching overturns the common human instinct to divide experience into good and evil. Peaceful and wrathful are not opposites here. They are different expressions of the same underlying awareness. When recognized, both lead to liberation. When misunderstood, both lead to confusion. The reason these visions appear so vividly is that in the bardo, there is no distance between thought and experience. In ordinary life, emotion arises, but it is filtered through the body, social context, and time. In the bardo, emotion becomes environment. Fear does not feel like fear. It feels like a terrifying world. Desire does not feel like desire. It feels like a magnetic force pulling consciousness forward. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is uncompromising in its message at this stage. The mind creates its own reality. There is no one else to blame, no external judge to appease, no refuge except awareness itself. This can sound harsh, but it is also deeply empowering. If the mind creates the experience, then recognition can dissolve it. What makes this stage so difficult is familiarity. Throughout life, the mind has practiced reacting automatically. Attraction leads to pursuit. Aversion leads to escape. In the bardo, these reactions become destiny. Chasing pleasant visions or fleeing terrifying ones propels consciousness further into the cycle of becoming. The text does not deny how overwhelming this is. It does not assume heroic calm. That is why it was traditionally read aloud again and again, as if to anchor the consciousness in recognition when it is most vulnerable. The voice of the living serves as a reminder of truth in a realm where memory itself is unstable. In the next part, we will examine how these reactions solidify into the drive toward rebirth, and how desire, fear, and identity shape the next life before it even begins. As the visions of the bardo intensify and then begin to fade, consciousness enters a phase that is quieter, heavier, and more directional. The dramatic clarity of radiant lights and powerful forms gives way to something more familiar, yet far more binding. This is the stage where the momentum of habit takes over, and the pull toward rebirth becomes almost irresistible. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes this not as a punishment imposed from outside, but as a natural consequence of unrecognized mind. At this point, consciousness begins to feel a sense of lack. The openness of the clear light is gone. The intensity of visionary forms has subsided. What remains is a subtle anxiety, a searching, a need to become something again. Identity, which briefly dissolved at death, now starts to reform. The mind looks for a reference point, a story, a place to land. This is where desire and aversion quietly shape the future. The text explains that consciousness, driven by karmic tendencies, becomes drawn toward certain environments. It is attracted to warmth, intimacy, familiarity. It is repelled by cold, isolation, and fear. These attractions are not random. They reflect deep patterns formed over a lifetime, patterns of attachment, craving, resentment, and longing. What feels like choice is often habit in motion. In symbolic language, the Tibetan Book of the Dead describes visions of couples, homes, shelters, and doorways. These are not literal instructions, but metaphors for the mind's movement toward embodiment. Attraction pulls consciousness forward. Aversion pushes it away. Between these forces, rebirth occurs. The future body is not assigned. It is entered. What is striking about this teaching is its psychological precision. Long before modern neuroscience or psychology, this text recognized that identity is not fixed. It is constructed through repetition. At death, when the old structure collapses, the same patterns rush in to rebuild it. Without awareness, the mind recreates itself according to what it knows best. There is no condemnation in this process, no moral outrage. The text does not describe rebirth as failure. It describes it as continuation. Life flows into life the way a river flows around stones. Liberation is not the default outcome, but neither is it rare. It simply requires recognition at the right moment. Even here, the text does not abandon hope. It continues to speak to the consciousness, reminding it not to be seduced by appearances, not to be repelled by fear, and not to mistake temporary forms for lasting refuge. The possibility of awakening has not vanished. It has merely become more difficult. This stage reveals the deepest message of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Death does not erase responsibility. It reveals it. Every habit of mind matters, not because of moral judgment, but because of momentum. What we rehearse in life becomes what carries us forward when everything else falls away. In the next part, we will step back and examine the cultural and historical role of this text, and why it was never meant to be read as mythology, but as a practical guide woven into the fabric of Tibetan life. To understand the Tibetan Book of the Dead fully, it must be placed back into the world that gave birth to it. This text was never intended to be read silently, alone, as philosophy or abstract spirituality. It was meant to be spoken, heard, felt. Its power lies not only in its words, but in its function within a living culture that treated death as a shared responsibility rather than a private terror. In traditional Tibetan society, death was not hidden behind hospital curtains or removed from daily life. It was present, acknowledged, and prepared for. The reading of the bardo was a communal act. A lama, monk, or trained practitioner would read the text aloud at the bedside of the dying, and later beside the body itself. The voice was steady, compassionate, and direct, addressing the consciousness as if it were still fully present. Because, according to the tradition, it was. This practice reveals something essential. Death was not seen as a moment of helplessness, but as a critical phase of consciousness that deserved guidance and care. Just as a child is guided at birth, the dying were guided at departure. The living did not assume that death was beyond influence. They assumed awareness could still be reached. The cultural context of Tibet shaped this worldview deeply. Life at high altitude, in harsh conditions, reinforced impermanence as a lived reality. Survival depended on cooperation, awareness, and respect for forces beyond individual control. Spiritual practice was not separate from daily life. It was woven into it. Death rituals, meditation, and ethical conduct formed a single continuum. This is why the Tibetan Book of the Dead does not read like doctrine. It reads like instruction. It does not argue. It reminds. It assumes that the listener already possesses the capacity for awakening, but needs help remembering it under pressure. The repetition in the text is deliberate. In moments of fear and confusion, repetition becomes stability. Modern readers often mistake the vivid imagery of the text for mythology. But within its original setting, these descriptions were understood as experiential maps, not literal geography. Just as modern psychology uses symbolic language to describe inner states, this text uses form, color, and sound to describe mental experience at its most intense. There is also a profound ethical implication embedded in the ritual use of this book. The living are reminded, again and again, that they too will pass through these states. Hearing the text read for another is also training for oneself. Death becomes a teacher long before it arrives. This approach stands in sharp contrast to modern culture, where death is often denied, delayed, or sanitized. In avoiding death, we lose an essential mirror. The Tibetan tradition insists that remembering death clarifies life. It sharpens values. It exposes trivial concerns. It asks a question few are comfortable facing. If everything ended today, what would remain in the mind? In the next part, we will explore how modern science, psychology, and near-death research have begun to echo insights found in this ancient text, and why the Tibetan Book of the Dead feels unexpectedly relevant in the modern world. As modern science has pushed deeper into the study of consciousness, an unexpected dialogue has begun to form between ancient texts and contemporary research. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, once viewed purely as a religious artifact, now finds itself revisited through the lenses of neuroscience, psychology, and near-death studies. What emerges is not proof in the scientific sense, but resonance. Patterns that feel strangely familiar. Researchers studying near-death experiences have documented recurring themes reported by people across cultures. A sense of leaving the body, intensified awareness, encounters with light, a feeling of being drawn forward or pulled back. While these accounts vary, their emotional structure often mirrors the stages described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The emphasis is not on the accuracy of imagery, but on the role of perception. Experience appears to be shaped not only by physiology, but by expectation, familiarity, and mental conditioning. Modern psychology, too, has begun to recognize how deeply the mind constructs reality. Emotions are no longer understood merely as reactions, but as organizing forces that shape perception itself. Fear narrows awareness. Attachment distorts judgment. Calm expands clarity. These insights echo the core message of the Bardo teachings. When external reference points fall away, the mind reveals its own architecture. What makes the Tibetan Book of the Dead particularly relevant today is its insistence that awareness can be trained. Consciousness is not a passive witness, but a skill. Meditation, mindfulness, and reflective practices are now widely studied for their effects on emotional regulation, attention, and resilience. While modern science avoids metaphysical claims, it increasingly agrees on one point. Familiarity with the mind changes how we experience extreme states. In a world marked by anxiety, uncertainty, and rapid change, the concept of the bardo extends beyond death. Many people experience psychological bardos throughout life. The loss of identity after a major life change, the disorientation following trauma, the collapse of meaning during crisis. These moments share the same characteristics described in the text: instability, intensity, vulnerability, and opportunity. The Tibetan Book of the Dead does not promise comfort. It offers clarity. It does not eliminate fear. It teaches how fear arises, and in doing so, it quietly hands responsibility back to the individual. Not as blame, but as empowerment. If the mind shapes experience, then understanding the mind becomes the most practical form of preparation. This may explain why the text continues to inspire artists, filmmakers, philosophers, and seekers around the world. It speaks to a universal intuition that beneath culture, belief, and story, there is a shared human confrontation with impermanence, and that how we meet it matters. In the final part, we will bring this journey to a close by reflecting on the ultimate message of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and why its deepest teaching is not about dying at all, but about learning how to live with awareness, courage, and compassion. At the end of this long and unsettling journey, the Tibetan Book of the Dead leaves us with a realization that is both humbling and liberating. It was never meant to be a book obsessed with death. It is a book obsessed with clarity. Death is simply the moment when clarity can no longer be postponed. The text does not ask us to believe in a specific vision of the afterlife. It asks something far more demanding. It asks us to look directly at how the mind works when it is stripped of comfort, routine, and distraction. It asks us to recognize that fear, desire, and identity are not external enemies, but internal movements. And it asks us to see that awareness, once recognized, does not depend on circumstances to exist. The most radical message of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is that nothing fundamentally new happens at death. What happens is amplification. The mind becomes louder. Habits become faster. Truth becomes unavoidable. Death does not change us. It reveals us. This is why the text insists, again and again, that preparation must happen now. Not through superstition or ritual alone, but through familiarity with awareness itself. Every moment of presence in life is rehearsal. Every moment of unconscious reaction is rehearsal too. There is no neutral ground. Yet this message is not meant to burden us with anxiety. It is meant to free us from illusion. If liberation depends on recognition, then even an imperfect life contains infinite potential. One moment of genuine awareness can outweigh years of confusion. One clear seeing can interrupt an entire chain of habit. In this way, the Tibetan Book of the Dead speaks not only to monks or mystics, but to anyone who has ever felt lost, afraid, or uncertain. It speaks to the part of us that senses there must be more than the stories we tell ourselves. It reminds us that beneath fear lies clarity, beneath chaos lies awareness, and beneath death lies the same mystery that has always been present in life. The final lesson is quiet, but it endures. Do not wait for death to teach you what life is trying to show you now. Learn to recognize awareness in small moments, in silence, in loss, in uncertainty. Because when the final transition arrives, recognition will not come from effort. It will come from familiarity. If this journey through the Tibetan Book of the Dead has given you a new perspective, a deeper question, or a moment of reflection, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. Your support allows me to continue creating thoughtful, meaningful content that preserves wisdom, explores history, and serves the wider community. In the end, the book leaves us with no doctrine to defend and no fear to cling to. Only a mirror and a simple, demanding invitation.